There are people and places in the province who know very well just how much they rely on the Great Lakes. Some others don't always seem to realize the importance of those vast bodies of water. And come election time, well, let's pay some attention to them now, shall we? In Waterloo, Ontario, Kelsey Leonard. She is Canada Research Chair and Assistant Professor in the Faculty of Environment at the University of Waterloo and a member of the International Joint Commission's Great Lakes Water Quality Board. And here in Ontario's capital city, Michelle Woodhouse, Water Program Manager at Environmental Defence, and it's great to have you two on our program tonight. Michelle, to you first. We have been working on a few different campaigns within the Great Lakes region, especially on Lake Erie. Give us some updates on what's going on there now.
Yeah, so for Lake Erie, we have the Ontario government and Canadian government that are trying to work together to meet our 40% reduction targets for phosphorus inputs into the basin, into the central and western basin of the lake. And right now, as it stands, we have been waiting on an implementation plan for the last few years since something called the Canada-Ontario Lake Action Plan was released. And this is meant to help province and federal government work together to meet our commitments, binational commitments under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement for addressing nutrient management issues and pollution in the Great Lakes. And currently, as it stands, we haven't received an implementation plan yet. We had some aspirational interim targets, such as in 2020, where we had the province that the leadership that was empowered during the time commit to an aspirational goal of 20% reductions by 2020 from 2008 levels. However, we haven't had any updates or progress reports back on how we're doing at meeting those targets or how we're measuring the effectiveness of the current investment levels and policies we have in place to try and meet those targets.
Kelsey, let's get you in here now. How do the challenges faced by Lake Erie affect First Nations communities in the province of Ontario?
Well, I think it's really important for us to actually consider that Lake Erie is an international lake. So it's not just we can't just set imaginary boundaries of it only affects First Nations in Ontario, it only affects the province of Ontario. It is an international lake, so it affects both states in the U.S. and cities and communities surrounding the basin. It also affects First Nations that are on what's currently known as the Canadian side of the border, and then those also on the U.S. side of the border. And for those First Nations and Indigenous nations and communities that have been living and stewarding this portion of the world for thousands of years, it's very emotionally as well as physically harmful for communities to have to deal with the legacy of contamination that we see in the Western and Central Basin. Despite those legacy contaminants and the legacy of environmental harm in this particular portion of Lake Erie, we also see great innovation happening, utilizing Indigenous knowledge and science and stewardship practices to think about how we can push forward to meeting some of these targets that were just mentioned to really try and address nutrient overload in the lake.
I often hear, though, Kelsey, that although we talk a good game in Ontario in terms of what we're able to bring to this party to clean things up, it's in fact our American cousins on the other side of the border and some of the states there that are actually doing a better job at that. Can you weigh in on that?
Yes, and I don't necessarily want to say that someone's doing a better job than others. What I will say is that our U.S. counterparts have an influx of resources, and they really have put monetary capital behind research and innovation and restoration efforts through its initiatives like the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. And we're not seeing the same type of capital investments on the Ontario provincial side, as well as on the federal side for the Canadian federal government. And so when we're thinking about what does it take to tackle one of, there are gravest environmental harms across the Great Lakes Basin, what we're seeing in the central and western basin of Lake Erie, we need more resources. We need for citizens around the Great Lakes to realize the type of environmental harm and degradation that's been occurring in the basin for, over a century, but more commonly known in the past half century as an area that their tax dollars and their resources should be going towards help conserving and restoring.
Okay, Michelle, let's pick up another issue here, namely algae bloom. That's among the top issues that we hear about. Again, we've talked about on this program. Give us an overview of how it's affecting water systems in the province of Ontario again.
Yeah, for sure. So we are seeing the presence of algae blooms and the severity of them consistently increasing over the years. We have some years that are worse than others, but we are seeing a trend that the blooms are becoming worse. They are growing and they're toxic. And the issue with these blooms is that they end up suffocating out the oxygen from the lakes. They can cause fisheries to collapse. They cause very high costs to drinking water sources because the water treatment that you need to use to when there is high levels of contamination from the blooms is very expensive to implement. These cause issues to human health. They can be fatal to animals. And it also is impacting things such as tourism because it limits opportunities for recreational use and leisure use of the lakes. It even impacts things such as property values because of just how bad these blooms are when they grow to be quite large and toxic.
So it really behooves us to do something about this, in your view.
Yes, absolutely.
I am picking that up, indeed. All right, Kelsey, back to you. I note that the federal government recently announced a $144 million program in Indigenous leadership to foster community-led climate action. You know, when you think of climate action, I suspect a lot of people think big, right? They think about big international organizations that can work on this. But this is very much focused on very local, very community-focused action. How much of a role can that play in getting us to the finish line here?
It is critical and vital to getting us to the finish line. And I think what is really interesting about this funding inflection is also that these communities who are now, having the potential to access this funding, they are on the front lines of our climate crisis. They're already being directly impacted by climate change and by these climatic changes in their local communities. And so they've already been fighting and working towards achieving climate action in their local communities for decades, if not longer. And they've been doing so very resource strapped and without funding capacity. And so I think what we're seeing now is, even with that limited funding, the amount of success that local community activists have had in changing the types of opportunities we have to address our climate crisis, that now the funding and resources are going to be put back into those communities to expound upon and to build upon the great foundation that they've already laid. So I think it's a very promising initiative, but it also pales in comparison to some of the other types of funding opportunities and resources that are being put forward to address our climate crisis. So although it's a great step in the right direction, we still are going to need more resources to truly tackle our climate crisis.
And where are you going to get those resources from?
Exactly. And I think it really should be coming from the federal government. I think we also need to see more advocacy at the provincial government level. And, through the Great Lakes Water Quality Board and the International Joint Commission, we do a Great Lakes regional poll every 3 years. And consistently in our 2015, 2018, and 2021 polls, we found that residents throughout the Great Lakes region of both the U.S. and Canada, as well as First Nation communities, are more than 90% interested in protecting the lakes and doing whatever we can to protect the lakes. And so I think the community power and collective action is there. I think we just need to be translating those principles and ideals and value systems into our legislative system, and we're just not fully there yet.
Okay, Michelle, how do waste management policies affect lake conservation?
If you're going to talk about this, I can think of this just based off the kinds of work that I do in terms of nutrient management waste, but also things like plastic waste is a huge issue with the Great Lakes. We see 22 million pounds of plastic on average entering the Great Lakes each year. So when it comes to waste management policies, and if I speak to this question just from a nutrient management perspective, I think the most important thing we need to think about is reducing the inputs of nutrient pollution that are entering the lakes. There's a few, like we can also tweak the system and change the practices that we're using. So there's something called best management practices for agriculture that reduce the amount of excess fertilizer and waste running off into the basin. But we actually need to reduce these inputs from a systemic level. And some of that involves things like from the very early stages and steps. You have things like crop advisors giving advice to farmers about applying fertilizers at the right rates. And it's worth noting that oftentimes these crop advisors are also working for private interests where there's an incentive to sell more fertilizer. So we have excess phosphorus inputs entering the Great Lakes. And then switching gears a little bit to plastic waste, in terms of provincial management of this issue and how it impacts the Great Lakes, we know, for example, things like deposit returns on non-alcoholic bottles are a proven way to help keep plastic waste out of our waterways, out of our landfills, and Ontario doesn't currently have that. We also know things like reuse systems can help out with our waste management problems. But at the end of the day, we need to also be addressing the fact that we have large amounts of new plastics that are entering the economy and society every year. And we need to also be looking at what are the incentives for the plastic industry to be a part of the solution if we need to reduce the amount of new plastics entering waterways and entering the Great Lakes, but their incentives are driven by producing more to make more money. There's a conflict of interest at play. So we have to think about what kinds of policies and legislation could help us to actually reduce the amount of new plastics that's entering society, in addition to some of these other fixes, such as things like deposit return programs.
And how much of an appetite do you see among decision makers to solve this problem?
I think there's definitely a lot of people across different levels of government and different agencies who do want to address this issue. I think that there is always going to be pushback from large industries such as plastics, same with agriculture, same way we see fossil fuels push back on climate goals. But I do think that there is an appetite to solve the issue. One of the things that that's difficult to address is when you're dealing with these issues across different levels of jurisdiction, where you have multiple agencies that are responsible for pulling different levers, like the Ministry of Agriculture and the Ministry of Environment. It's not always easy to get everyone rowing in the same direction to achieve the outcomes for the environment that would be most desirable, while also having parties that are looking to balance economic growth and other factors such as that.
Rowing in the same direction is a perfect metaphor when we're doing a program here about the Great Lakes, so well done on that. Let me, we obviously wanted you two here because we're in the midst of a provincial election campaign right now, and we're trying to gauge how much interest there is among the four major parties, and the others for that matter, on making some progress on the issues that you two care about so much. So let's get this on the record here. The Chiefs of Ontario released a call to action for the next provincial government last month titled Creating a New Legacy, Building a Strong Foundation for Future Generations. And it includes 5 priorities, one of which is sustainable community development and environmental protection. And here's an excerpt. Climate change is disproportionately affecting the health and well-being of First Nations peoples in Ontario and has increased food insecurity for many already vulnerable communities. The Government of Ontario must ensure that First Nations are afforded the resources and political access necessary to become active participants in decision-making processes related to climate change mitigation, adaptation, and monitoring. Okay, Kelsey, come on in here. How much are you seeing among the four major parties in particular to address the issues just enlisted in that paragraph?
Quite honestly, not much. And when we do see these issues adequately and thoroughly addressed with nuanced attention to detail, they are often being addressed by Indigenous candidates themselves running in the provincial elections. So what we really need is to see more candidates across all of the parties and party leadership more predominantly responding to calls from First Nations, from organizations like the Chiefs of Ontario, and really building upon these calls to action that have been sort of put forward for them on a silver platter. And yet we're not really seeing them being picked up properly or authentically. And so I think if we're going to tackle climate change, we really have to address those frontline communities, which are Indigenous nations, and we're not currently seeing that from the parties right now, and that's unfortunate.
Michelle, how about you? Are you seeing enough in the party platforms to make you feel somewhat optimistic about the way things might go?
I think that there's definitely some strong platforms out there that have the environment in mind, that have climate change in mind and freshwater protections in mind. I think that we can do better. I think it's up to everyone to do their own research and look at what are these parties saying they're going to do when it comes to the environment and things like freshwater protection, and how does that align with what environmental experts and groups such as the organization that I work for, Environmental Defence Canada, how does that align with what we're saying needs to be done in order to protect the natural world, in order to have strong conservation policies. I think it's really important for when folks are going out to vote for the next leadership and they're thinking of issues such as the environment in mind, which is only one important issue, but they're thinking about how are we prioritizing growing our province and developing our province, but not doing it at the cost of things that will cause immense harm to the environment in the near term and in the long term. We can't have governments that are putting forward development visions that are not taking into account what environmental experts are saying when it comes to things like growing our cities and improving mobility between our cities as well.
Yeah, Kelsey, I know all the major parties have got something to say about the environment writ large, but I must confess, off the top of my head, I can't recall, and that's not to say it hasn't happened, but I can't recall seeing anything specifically about the Great Lakes, and in particular about Indigenous communities that depend on the Great Lakes in the platforms. Am I missing something? Is there something there that you know of?
At this time, no, there's not something more that I know of. I do know that, as I mentioned earlier, that specific candidates have raised certain issues that maybe they feel fall under the larger environmental issue platform of certain parties, but it's on a case-by-case basis. And like I said before, for those issues that are of grave concern for First Nations and Indigenous communities, like our ongoing water crises, they've largely been raised by Indigenous candidates running within the provincial election. And that's not to say that others may not be doing it, but I definitely have not seen it at the level of Indigenous candidates. And to really make a concerted effort to change these systemic crises, we need everyone to be a part of the process for change and to really be strong in their allyship.
Okay, Michelle, I don't want to get you into trouble here. Honestly, I really don't want to get you into trouble because I think you're affiliated with a nonprofit, a charitable status organization, which tries really hard to avoid being partisan in a political way. So I'm not asking for your endorsement of any particular party running in this election. But having said that, if you did want to weigh in and say what these guys are saying about these issues we like, and what these guys aren't saying about these issues we're disappointed in, now's the time.
Well, it is a great question. I have had a chance to look over all of the different platforms by the different parties. And I think from what I've seen in terms of balancing things like climate change and freshwater protections, there are certain platforms that do stand out from what's being put on paper.
You want to name names?
From what I can see, I think that the Liberals, as well as the NDP and the Green Party, have all put forward some commitments to the environment that would achieve, desirable outcomes for the environment and put us on a right track. I haven't seen much come out of the Conservative platform. There is some things in there to do with electric vehicles, which are also obviously an important part of the solution in terms of climate change. But beyond that, I don't know much what their plan is in terms of conserving nature, protecting the Great Lakes, protecting fresh water, addressing climate change in a way that will help us meet our targets. But what parties put on platforms and what they are able to roll out when they're in power and implement is something that remains to be seen after each election. So I would just again encourage people to go and do their own research and look at what are the party platforms saying, because at the end of the day, for someone like myself in an organization that I work for, it's not so much about, it isn't about the party, it really is about what are they saying they're going to do for the environment and how will it benefit the environment.
Well,
And we would be partners with, we would, as an NGO and a nonprofit, want to be partners with whatever kind of government comes into power in terms of helping us achieve the environmental objectives that we would like to see happen.
sure. And Kelsey, I mean, in fairness, there has been a great deal of discussion about EV, electric vehicles. There's been a lot of discussion about electricity generation and what's the cleanest form of making that happen. Carbon policies, you know, how to get more carbon out of the air. We have heard a lot about that. Water conservation, I'm not sure I've heard much, if anything, about that. Do we need to be talking about that more in this campaign?
Definitely. When we think about climate change, the hydrologic system is critical to being able to maintain planetary well-being. So if we are not actively working to conserve and create legislation and regulations that conserve and preserve our water resources and the Great Lakes, then we are largely in part actively working against or working to advance our climate crisis rather than try to address it and to heal the climate emergency that we currently have ongoing. So protecting water is critical to achieving the targets that we've set out for climate change. Another way to think about this is that climate justice, which many climate activists and those seeking climate action are working towards, is not possible without water justice. And so ensuring that there is access to clean, safe drinking water for all, and ensuring that freshwater ecosystems themselves have the water necessary to be healthy and thrive is a key component to maintaining biodiversity and addressing our climate crisis.
And Kelsey, just in our last minute here, I know you're a member of the Great Lakes Water Quality Board, which is a nonpartisan organization. So again, I'm not asking you to do anything you don't want to do here. But, you know, again, as I offered Michelle the chance, if you want to say which of the major parties you think has the best story to tell on this, now's the time.
I actually think I'm in a very fortuitous position that all of the parties have somewhere to grow and somewhere to build from, because right now, as you mentioned earlier, we're not seeing a level of engagement with issues and platforms around the Great Lakes, around water conservation, around engagement and support for Indigenous and First Nations throughout the province. And so being able to see more of that, being able to see more parties actually respond to the beautiful ideas that were put forward by the Chiefs of Ontario, I think would give me the opportunity in the future to maybe be able to respond to that question. So it's a bit of a race. Let's see which party actually decides to step up to the plate and do calls to action that respond to Indigenous nations and their needs in this election.
Gotcha. Kelsey Leonard, Michelle Woodhouse, good of both of you to join us on TVO tonight. We're very grateful.
Thank you.
Have a good evening. Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.